Think about one of the most important yet invisible products on the planet. It's a tiny, unassuming white pellet. You've probably never held one, but it helps grow the food on your plate and, in some places, even cleans the exhaust from the trucks that deliver it. For the past year, the world's biggest producer of this chemical, China, basically turned off the tap. They slammed the door shut on exports, sending a quiet shockwave through global agriculture and supply chains. Farmers in Chile, politicians in South Korea, they were left scrambling. But then, this past July, the floodgates didn't just open, they burst. Shipments of this chemical, urea, exploded by over 600%. This isn't a simple return to business as usual, though. It's more like a carefully controlled release. Beijing is deciding who gets it, how much, and when. And when you look at the destinations and one particularly massive neighbor who might be next in line, you realize this isn't just a story about fertilizer. It's a quiet but powerful move in a much bigger game of economic pressure and shifting alliances. So what's really behind this sudden reversal? Today, we're taking a deep dive into the fascinating complex world of urea, China's strategic shift in its export policies, the ripple effects across global markets, and the geopolitical chess match being played out in this seemingly mundane commodity. We'll be connecting the dots between farmers on their land and policymakers in high-stakes meetings, giving you a full picture of why this tiny pellet holds so much power. Okay, let's unpack this. Before we dive into the recent policy shifts, it's absolutely crucial that we all understand what urea actually is and why China's role is so incredibly central to its global availability. In its simplest form, urea is a nitrogen-rich compound, fundamental to modern agriculture. You've probably seen pictures of it, those small white crystalline pellets. Its primary function, the one most people know, is as a fertilizer. It acts as a powerhouse for promoting plant growth, ensuring our crops flourish, and ultimately boosting the yields of everything from corn to wheat to rice and countless vegetables. Without it, global food production would look, well, dramatically different.
And that's just the start. What's truly fascinating is how something so fundamental to modern life remains largely invisible to most people. We interact with its effects every day, from the food on our plates to maybe the cleaner air we breathe, yet the substance itself often goes unnoticed. But urea is far more versatile than just that. Beyond the fields, it plays a critical role in environmental protection. It's a key chemical component in products like diesel exhaust fluid, or DIF, sometimes known as AdBlue, that's used in vehicles and industrial machinery to significantly reduce harmful diesel and industrial emissions. For countries with strict environmental regulations like South Korea, this isn't just a nice-to-have, it's a vital part of keeping their air cleaner and their transport systems running.
That dual role in both agriculture and environmental efforts truly highlights its critical and often understated importance across such diverse and essential sectors. But I wonder, is one of those roles more vulnerable to supply shocks than the other, given global priorities?
That's a fantastic question because while both are critical, the environmental role, particularly for things like diesel exhaust fluid, often has less immediate flexibility. Farmers, to some extent, can adjust planting or maybe opt for alternative fertilizers if prices spike, even if it's painful and impacts yields. They have some options, usually. But for a country like South Korea, which has strict emission standards and relies heavily on Chinese urea for DF, a disruption means trucks literally can't run.
Wow, literally stop.
Yes, that's an immediate high-stakes crisis that can paralyze transport and logistics very, very quickly. The stakes are incredibly high in both scenarios, but perhaps more immediately acute for the DF application.
Okay, let's talk about China's position in this market. It's nothing short of dominant, right? When we talk about global fertilizer use and production, China accounts for nearly a quarter of it. That's huge. Historically, before the recent policy shifts, China was an exceptionally significant global exporter of urea, playing a crucial role in international supply chains. However, it's important to understand the context. Despite its massive production capacity and its historical role as an exporter, the vast majority of China's urea output is dedicated to its own domestic needs. To put that in perspective, in 2020, exports accounted for less than 10% of its total supply. Their domestic market always comes first. That fundamentally shapes their approach. So it's not just about raw volume, is it? It's also about the foundational economics of how it's made, which gives China unique leverage.
Absolutely. That's a crucial differentiator. Unlike most countries that primarily rely on natural gas as a feedstock for urea production, China's method is heavily coal-based. Approximately 75% of its urea production is derived from coal.
75%, that's a lot.
It really is. And it means that the price of urea in China is directly and intimately tied to the price of coal. This is a distinctive characteristic compared to other major global producers. If global natural gas prices fluctuate, that impacts many producers, sure. But for China, it's global or domestic coal prices that truly drive the cost of production and, by extension, the domestic price of urea. This gives them a distinct internal pricing dynamic.
So the journey to these export restrictions wasn't a sudden event. It was more of a gradual buildup, starting around 2021. Early that year, as the world began to recover from the immediate impacts of the pandemic, we saw a rapid increase in both industrial and agricultural demand. This recovery quickly led to a tightening of urea supply conditions, not just globally, but crucially within China itself. Then, between July and October of 2021, a significant coal supply shortage emerged. You mentioned coal.
Right, the key input.
This shortage triggered a sharp increase in coal prices, which, given China's unique coal-based production method, directly impacted urea production costs. This moment was, well, it seems like a critical turning point, escalating the internal pressures on the domestic urea market. So how did the government first react to this escalating situation?
Well, responding to these internal pressures, the Chinese government began implementing interventions in October 2021. They started with stricter export controls. It wasn't an outright ban at first, but they mandated inspection certificates for all urea shipments.
Bureaucracy is policy.
Exactly. This seemingly bureaucratic step had significant teeth. It complicated and significantly lengthened the export process. So it effectively reduced the volume of urea leaving the country without officially banning anything. It was a sort of soft power choke on the supply.
That initial move, while perhaps internally aimed at ensuring domestic stability and managing costs, had immediate and noticeable international repercussions. Global supply chains, which had grown accustomed to the steady flow of Chinese urea exports, suddenly found themselves having to reevaluate their sourcing strategies. It created a ripple effect of uncertainty across the world. And China didn't stop there, did they?
No, not at all. Following that, in December 2021, China went a step further by launching a temporary fertilizer reserve program. This was a massive initiative. They aimed at stockpiling 3 million metric tons of fertilizer, which included a substantial 1.3 million metric tons of urea.
1.3 million tons. That's roughly, what, 25% of their annual production?
Exactly, around a quarter. The primary objective was clearly stated: to ensure sufficient domestic supplies were available for the crucial 2022 summer growing season. This supplemented an already existing off-season reserve program. They were clearly playing the long game for their own agricultural output, prioritizing food security at home.
And that massive stockpiling effort, particularly during the period from December 2021 to February 2022, had an interesting and somewhat paradoxical impact, didn't it?
Yeah.
It created unexpectedly strong demand within the domestic market, which actually contributed to higher domestic prices in the short term.
That's right.
While this did help lower prices later in the summer of 2022 by increasing availability eventually, the initial effect was almost counterintuitive to some of the stated goals. It seems like a complex dance between policy intent and market reality.
It absolutely was, and this layered approach continued. More recently, we saw the China Agricultural Means of Production Association, or CAMPE, step in. This past May, they developed what they called a self-discipline mechanism for urea exports.
Self-discipline, so not a direct government order.
Well, it wasn't a top-down government edict in the same way, but rather a coordinated effort among key distribution enterprises. These are the companies responsible for maintaining supply stability and price regulation. Their stated goal was to conduct urea exports in a steady and orderly manner.
So Beijing was clearly trying to orchestrate things very tightly with CAMPA, using both direct government controls and this industry-led self-discipline. What were the specific goals and measures they were trying to enforce with this new mechanism?
The stated goals were very clear: guide healthy exports while prioritizing domestic agricultural demand, promote high-quality development within the fertilizer industry, and crucially, to safeguard the stability of the domestic fertilizer market. This wasn't just guidance, it included specific measures. Enterprises were encouraged to act prudently in their production and procurement activities, maintain reasonable profit margins, and prioritize public welfare by avoiding excessive price hikes. They were explicitly advised against spreading rumors, engaging in speculative hype, or hoarding behaviors.
So trying to manage the market psychology too.
Precisely. Furthermore, CAMPA even threatened punitive measures, such as suspending membership privileges, against any entities found disrupting market stability. It was an elaborate system designed to maintain internal control and prevent market chaos.
So what we're seeing from this simple pellet is a whole story of strategic national interest. driven by internal economic pressures managed through a layered policy approach that evolves in response to market dynamics and domestic priorities. It's a fascinating look at how deeply integrated state policy is with basic commodities in China. When China effectively turned off the tap on urea exports, the impact was both immediate and widespread. It went far beyond abstract market shifts. It affected real farmers and real industries across the globe. We saw countries like Chile, Mexico, Sri Lanka, New Zealand scrambling to secure alternative supplies. South Korea, in particular, faced a significant challenge because of its heavy reliance on Chinese urea for its diesel exhaust fluid, DEF, critical for vehicle emissions. Even India, traditionally a major importer, began proactively diversifying its sources, looking towards the Middle East and Africa to secure its fertilizer needs.
It was a global wake-up call, really. Supply chains that had grown maybe a bit complacent, relying on China as the consistent, affordable supplier, suddenly found themselves exposed. This wasn't just an inconvenience. For some, it was an existential threat to their agricultural seasons or their ability to comply with environmental regulations.
To give you a real-world sense of this, let's look at Javier, a soybean farmer in Mato Grosso, Brazil. Last year, the high cost of urea hit his operations hard. He had to leave a portion of his valuable land fallow because the economics simply didn't make sense. He heard the whispers, understood that it was largely due to China, the world's primary supplier, restricting its exports. But this year, the atmosphere at his local co-op is notably different. The manager shared the good news. A large shipment of urea had just cleared customs. And crucially, it was at a price that offered Javier significant relief, allowing him to plant his full acreage. The origin of this vital shipment. A port in China. For Javier, this isn't about the intricacies of international relations. It's about the fundamental ability to cultivate his crops and support his family. Yet, as he signed for the delivery, a thought lingered. His entire livelihood, the very fate of his harvest, now hinges on a policy decision made thousands of miles away in Beijing. It was, as he expressed, a profound mix of gratitude for the immediate relief and a deep sense of vulnerability. It really brings home the human element of these global trade decisions.
This story perfectly illustrates the incredible soft power China wields on the global stage. It's not about military might or overt diplomatic pressure necessarily. It's about controlling the flow of a vital chemical that directly impacts global food security and the economic engines of nations. By regulating access to urea, China creates deep dependencies, making countries like Brazil acutely aware that their agricultural output, and thus their economic stability, is intrinsically linked to Beijing's domestic policy decisions. It's a powerful, quiet, but undeniable lever. And it shows that when China acts, the ripples are felt by individual farmers, not just corporate boardrooms or government ministries.
The statistical evidence of this export ban's impact is stark. Chinese urea exports plummeted by a staggering 47% in 2022 compared to 2021. And while China's exports were contracting, global fertilizer prices continued their upward trajectory. Urea prices more than doubled between mid-2021 and the first half of 2022. So the world was definitely feeling the pinch. Now here's where it gets really interesting and paradoxical. Despite China's stated goal of using these export restrictions to lower and stabilize domestic prices, the reality on the ground presented a very different picture. Instead of seeing prices drop at home, Chinese urea prices actually reached historical records in mid-2022.
Right, peak prices internally.
This marked a significant divergence from global trends, indicating that the internal dynamics within China's market were far more complex than simply cutting off exports to insulate domestic prices. It points to a more complex domestic situation than just cutting off exports. So if it didn't stabilize prices, what was happening internally that drove those domestic prices so high?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Because the stated policy was about domestic stability, yet the domestic market was anything but stable, at least initially. This suggests that the levers China was pulling for export control weren't the only or even the primary factors influencing their internal prices. It implies strong internal demand, perhaps production cost pressures we talked about with coal, or maybe even other domestic policy measures were creating their own pressures. These internal factors seem to have overshadowed the impact of reduced exports on price. It's almost as if the domestic market was a beast of its own, with its own complex internal ecosystem.
Fast forward to this past July, and suddenly the picture shifts dramatically. The tap wasn't just open to crack, it burst wide open. China reported an extraordinary surge in urea exports for that month. They exported 567,184 tons of urea. It's an astonishing increase of 614% year-on-year. It was also a 7.6-fold rise from June shipments, which themselves had already jumped significantly from earlier in the year.
A huge jump.
This remarkable surge was partly attributed to an exceptionally low base from last year's ban, underscoring the market speculation that controls were indeed easing. But if we connect this to the bigger picture, this isn't simply a return to business as usual, is it?
Not at all. Analysts describe it as a carefully controlled release. This nuance is crucial. It indicates that Beijing is not just allowing market forces to dictate exports, but rather there's a strategic intent behind this increase. The government is still very much in control, deciding who gets it, how much, and when, wielding this commodity as a policy instrument. It's a targeted strategy, not a free market reaction. They're releasing it, but very much on their own terms.
And it certainly appears to be a calibrated release, not an open floodgate. Exports in both June and July were conducted under government guidance with quota limits and price controls. This unmistakably signals that Beijing remains firmly in the driver's seat, meticulously managing who receives the urea, in what quantities, and precisely when. The destinations also expanded quite broadly, from 13 countries in June to 31 in July, demonstrating a calculated outreach. Shipments primarily targeted Latin America and Asia, with Chile, Mexico, Sri Lanka, New Zealand, and South Korea emerging as the top 5 importers. Together, these 5 countries accounted for over 65.7% of the total shipments, highlighting specific strategic relationships or perhaps urgent demands being addressed. What's even more telling is that despite the significant surge, total exports from May to July, which amounted to 635,861 tons, were still well below the reported quota. That quota was approximately 3 million tons, allocated in 2 batches earlier this year. So they've used barely a fifth of it.
Pretty much. This leaves significant room for future shipments in the coming months, in August and September. And it's worth noting that urea exports are seasonal. They typically rise in August and peak in September, driven by stronger demand in the southern hemisphere as their planting seasons approach. This seasonal pattern, combined with the large unused quota, suggests a deliberate, staged approach to re-entering the global market, not a complete abandonment of controls.
So China is still holding back a lot of its potential capacity for export. It's like they're managing a reservoir, letting out water, but keeping the main dam closed for now. Now let's talk about India, which suddenly finds itself in the spotlight. While customs data didn't immediately show any exports to India in July, Bloomberg reported just last week that Beijing had indeed eased its curbs on shipments to the country. This move is being interpreted by some as a significant sign of warming ties between these two Asian giants, especially considering that both nations are facing various pressures from U.S. trade policies. For India, this presents a fascinating policy dilemma. Imagine Mr. Rao, a senior official in India's Ministry of Chemicals and Fertilizers. He's balancing a tightrope walk between economic pragmatism and national security concerns. On one hand, economists within his ministry see this as a golden opportunity. Lower import costs, combat rising food inflation. That would be a huge economic and political win for India.
But on the other hand, his security advisors view this with deep skepticism, almost as a potential Trojan horse. They're questioning whether this is a genuine goodwill gesture or a more strategic move by China to create dependency, particularly at a time when India is actively deepening its ties with the U.S. and is a key member of the Quad alliance.
Right. The timing is interesting.
Exactly. It's like India is being offered a really appealing low-cost meal by a neighbor they have a very complicated relationship with. On one hand, it solves an immediate hunger problem, lower food inflation, happy farmers. But on the other, Mr. Rao's security team is saying, wait, is this just a cheap meal, or are we signing up for a long-term dependency that could be used against us later, especially given our evolving alliances? For Mr. Rao, the decision isn't merely about the chemical properties of urea, it's about navigating the complex, shifting currents of Asian geopolitics.
That's such a clear way to put it. So for India, a bag of Chinese urea is never just a bag of urea. It's imbued with symbolic weight and represents a fundamental choice. It's a trade-off between immediate economic relief, which is very appealing, and the long-term strategic autonomy that India strives for, especially within the context of the Indo-Pacific geopolitical competition. Beijing's strategic use of this commodity forces India to confront this dilemma directly.
And looking ahead, while exports to India could resume in August and September, volumes would likely remain limited. This is because China consistently prioritizes its domestic supply and stable internal prices. That seems to be the overriding principle. So it suggests a cautious and controlled approach, even with improving bilateral relations. So this isn't just about commodity prices, it's about delicate international relations, where a single chemical can become a bargaining chip in a much larger game. The global market is always looking at these kinds of signals.
To truly understand this reversal,
And the underlying strategy, we need to look behind the curtain into China's internal motivations and the hard data. Let's try to imagine the reality for someone like Chen Wei, a manager at a large urea plant in a province like Shandong. For the past year, his entire operation has been dictated by a singular principle: domestic priority. The vast majority of his plant's output was locked into government contracts, sold at fixed, low prices, specifically earmarked for farmers in agricultural heartlands like Henan and Sichuan. The pressure from provincial officials to meet these quotas was intense, with severe penalties for any shortfall. All the while, Chen Wei could see international market prices for urea soaring, acutely aware of the significant profits his plant was missing out on.
And that's a constant tension for him, isn't it? He's operating within a system designed to ensure national food security, even if it means sacrificing significant potential revenue for his plant. This is the reality for many state-linked enterprises in China. They have a mandate that goes beyond pure profit. It's a different operating model.
Now, the situation is evolving. Chen Wei has been granted a small but significant export quota. This opening presents a substantial financial incentive. Foreign buyers are offering double the government-mandated domestic price. This means Chen Wei is running his plant 24/7, pushing his equipment to its absolute limit, meticulously planning every single ton of urea this batch for the domestic reserve, that batch for the port. He feels a sense of renewed excitement, but it's tempered by intense pressure. He understands implicitly that this export window is a privilege, not a right, and that if domestic prices tick up even slightly, that gate could slam shut again tomorrow without warning.
This perspective is crucial because it fundamentally shifts our understanding of China's export potential. It shows that China's ability to supply the global market isn't a simple calculation of production capacity versus domestic consumption. Instead, it's profoundly governed by an overriding political imperative, ensuring domestic stability and food security above all else. Those unused export quotas we observe in the data are not just market inefficiencies, they are a strategic reserve, deliberately held back and managed by this internal calculus. It mirrors the constant tension Chen Wei experiences on his factory floor. This is a powerful demonstration of how internal policy translates directly to global supply. It explains why China has the capacity, but not necessarily the willingness, to export freely.
This is where the academic rigor helps us cut through the noise and see what's really driving the market. A fascinating study titled Deconstructing Fertilizer Price Spikes. Evidence from Chinese urea fertilizer market specifically examined urea price movements in China from January 2018 to August 2023. This research employed a sophisticated structural vector autoregression model, which, for those less familiar, you can think of it like a highly precise forensic tool. It untangles all the different threads contributing to a complex market situation. It allows them to pinpoint the real culprits behind price changes with a high degree of precision rather than just guessing.
Exactly. It's about getting past correlation to actual causation. And the study's findings on price drivers are quite illuminating. They found two dominant factors. First, rising energy costs, specifically coal prices, were a dominant contributor to urea price movements, particularly since late 2021.
Back to coal again.
Always back to coal in this case. The sharp spike observed in October 2021 was primarily driven by these increased energy costs. This directly supports our earlier point about China's coal-based production.
And the second dominant factor was what they termed idiosyncratic shocks. These were factors unrelated to input costs, agricultural demand, or exports, but were still dominant contributors to most Chinese urea price changes. So what exactly does that mean for the day-to-day operations of a plant manager like Chen Wei, or for farmers? What are these idiosyncratic shocks in practice?
Essentially, these are the wild card factors, anything from a sudden industrial accident at a plant to an unexpected government campaign cracking down on pollution that temporarily shuts down factories, or even new environmental regulations that restrict production. It highlights how internal, non-market forces play such a huge role in China's market. The mid-2022 price spike, for instance, was found to be a combination of elevated energy costs and, crucially, increased domestic demand triggered by the National Temporary Stockpiling Program we discussed earlier.
So the stockpiling itself pushed prices up.
In the short term, yes. The very act of trying to secure supply had an upward pressure on prices.
In contrast, some factors had a minimal impact. Shocks to corn prices, surprisingly, had a minimal influence on urea price fluctuations. And perhaps most notably, there was limited evidence that export demand significantly impacted domestic urea price changes.
That's the key takeaway, really.
This is critical. The research suggests that China's export restrictions, despite dramatically reducing actual exports, had a minimal impact on lowering domestic urea prices, unquote. The counterfactual analysis within the study clearly showed that prices would have behaved similarly even without these stringent restrictions.
This truly questions the effectiveness of such broad-stroke export bans as a tool for domestic price stabilization. It suggests China might have been addressing symptoms rather than the root causes of their domestic price issues. So in terms of the effectiveness of China's policy interventions, the data tells us that what seemed like a straightforward solution, restricting exports to lower domestic prices, didn't quite play out as intended in terms of domestic price stabilization. The study explicitly questions the effectiveness of these policies in achieving that goal, finding they had little impact on curbing domestic price spikes.
Furthermore, while the temporary reserve program did help lower the fertilizer prices in the 2022 summer growing season by releasing supplies, it also inadvertently contributed to urea price increases in China during the stockpiling period in early 2022. That was due to the surge in demand it created.
Firstly,
The internal demand and cost factors were far more influential than the export restrictions themselves in shaping domestic price trends. It really shows how complex economic interventions can be and how unintended consequences can arise. This deep dive reveals that urea is far more than just a commodity. It's a potent tool in a broader geopolitical landscape. China's meticulous control over urea exports is a quiet but powerful maneuver in a much larger game of economic pressure and shifting alliances. This situation is unfolding within the context of a fragile U.S.-China trade truce, which has been extended until November of this year. This truce has brought a temporary stabilization to supply chains for other strategic commodities like rare earths and semiconductors, indicating a delicate balancing act between the two global powers.
we've seen a sort of tit-for-tat dynamic playing out. For example, China resumed rare earth exports to the U.S. in June, which helped ease delays for electric vehicle and defense production. In return, the U.S. eased some export controls on advanced AI chips, such as NVIDIA's H20. Though with an interesting condition, yes. U.S. firms selling these chips to China now face a 15% revenue tax on those sales. This intricate dance of concessions highlights the complex web of dependencies and leverage points both superpowers are constantly navigating. This dynamic reveals how essential commodities, even something as seemingly mundane as fertilizer, quickly become instruments of foreign policy. The interplay between urea, rare earths, and semiconductors illustrates a complex web of dependencies and leverage that both sides are actively navigating. It underscores that in today's interconnected world, economic policy is often inseparable from national security and diplomatic strategy.
India, with its massive population, is performing a delicate balancing act. There has been significant progress in its food security efforts. The country has seen a notable decline in undernourishment rates, dropping from 14.3% in the 2020-22 period to 12% in 2022-24. That's good news.
Definitely positive progress.
This positive trend is largely attributed to the modernization of its public distribution systems. However, despite these gains, India still faces considerable challenges. Malnutrition, the high cost of healthy diets, and significant post-harvest losses, estimated at 13%, continue to be pressing issues. Given its enormous population, India's fertilizer needs remain substantial, making reliable and affordable access to urea absolutely crucial, even as it strives for greater self-reliance in its agricultural sector.
For India, securing fertilizer supply is not just an economic matter. It's fundamental to its social stability and its ability to feed its massive population. It's a national security issue woven into the fabric of daily life. The decision to accept or reject Chinese urea is therefore loaded with implications far beyond just a simple price tag.
Looking back at late 2024 and early 2025, we saw the global urea market experience continued volatility and potential price increases. This was primarily due to anticipated heightened fertilizer demand for the upcoming winter planting season at the time. Furthermore, persistent supply shortages exacerbated the situation. These shortages were driven by a confluence of factors: severe weather disruptions, ongoing gas supply issues like those in Iran impacting Brazil and Turkey.
And energy costs in Europe, too.
Right. Growing concerns over rising electricity costs, particularly in Europe, where the Dunkelflaut phenomenon reduced solar and wind energy generation, drove up production expenses. Adding to this tension, India's significant urea tenders, like its December 2024 tender for 1.5 million tons for January 2025 shipment, are known to trigger significant price increases across the board as global suppliers compete to meet this substantial demand. So it was a turbulent period.
And that turbulence set the stage for the current situation. In terms of long-term policy implications for China, the academic research we discussed earlier raises some critical questions about the efficacy of their approach. The study suggested that China's export restrictions had only a minimal impact on lowering domestic prices, indicating they weren't as effective in their primary stated goal as might have been hoped. Furthermore, prolonged restrictions can discourage investment in production and related infrastructure, potentially hindering China's broader supply-side reform efforts aimed at achieving more efficient and cleaner production processes in the urea industry.
It's a classic economic dilemma, isn't it? Short-term controls can sometimes stifle long-term growth and innovation. The research noted that as domestic urea prices had significantly declined, returning to pre-2021 levels by early 2024, lifting the restrictions seems advisable. The study also recommended considering complementary financial or tax support to urea producers to increase domestic supply, or targeted subsidies for fertilizer production, maybe even direct assistance to farmers as alternative policy options. Things that might be more effective and less disruptive than broad export bans.
This indicates a potential move towards more sophisticated, market-friendly interventions within China, rather than relying on broad export controls. The research strongly suggests that such controls, while perhaps politically appealing in the short term, prove less effective domestically and potentially more disruptive globally in the long run. Embracing more nuanced economic tools could lead to greater domestic stability and more predictable international supply flows, which would certainly be welcomed by the global market. It's a shift from a blunt instrument to a more precise surgical approach in managing a critical resource.
We've journeyed from a tiny white pellet to the intricate global dance of economics and geopolitics. What we've seen is how China's urea policy isn't just a simple supply and demand story, but a carefully calibrated instrument reflecting deep domestic priorities, evolving international relations, and complex market dynamics. It's a reminder that even the most unassuming commodities can be central to global power and the daily lives of millions, shaping everything from the food on your table to the intricate balance of international diplomacy.